Hello and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's review for The Forge, The Awakening, and Kir'shara, which are episodes 7, 8, and 9 of Season 4 of Star Trek Enterprise. This video is a part of a series of videos where I review episodes of Star Trek as determined by my Patreon polls. The episode to win my latest Patreon-only poll is this three-parter, some refer to as the Vulcan Trilogy, which includes The Forge, Awakenings, and Kir'shara. Now, first of all, I think I need to justify why I'm reviewing all three episodes in one video, because I actually went back and forth on whether or not I should split each episode up and do it individually or just do all three at once, because with the Season 4 of Enterprise had a lot of three-parters, or I think just, three-parters, that's right. This is the second one. And the first one, which was the one with the Augments Trilogy, I did a review for that, and I did all three episodes in one video. However, other shows like, even keeping in Enterprise, like arguably, and I would argue, the last three episodes of Season 3, the Council, Countdown, and 0 Hour form a three-parter, yet I did each of those episodes individually. In fact, I haven't even done Countdown yet, so I did them all out of order, too, because I did the Council, and then, like, a year later, I did 0 Hour, and haven't even done Countdown yet. And you could also apply the same thing to Deep Space Nine, where they have a lot of serialized arcs in Season 6 and Season 7. And in fact, a lot of people consider the last two episodes of the Dominion Takeover of the Station arc, Favor of the Bold and The Sacrifice of Angel, as a two-parter, yet I reviewed each episode separately. So I had to think, actually, whether or not I wanted to do these all three episodes at once. But here's how I kind of justify it. Like, when you have examples like the Xindi story arc of Season 3, even though, like, arguably, and I would argue those last three episodes form a three-parter, they're still part of a greater whole, of a greater arc that lasted all season. And same with your Deep Space Nine episodes, like even, the 10 episode arc that ended Season 7. I did each of those episodes individually. I haven't done them all yet, but I did random ones individually, even though they kind of form one story. But I think where I draw the line is that, like with the Season 3 story arc of Enterprise and the Deep Space Nine story arcs, they're part of a larger story arc, and even if you have a two-parter or three-parter within the story arc, it's still within a greater story arc. And so I view it more the way I review a show like Game of Thrones or Breaking Bad or The Expanse, where I do each episode individually, even though each episode tells a part of a larger story arc. So it's more of like the serialized shows where I would split it up by episode, even though it's only part of the story. Whereas I feel like these three-parters in Season 4, this one and the Augments one, they are isolated. Like, they're three episodes together. So it's more like these two-parters, which I would do in one video because they just tell one story, like The Best of Both Worlds or Past Tense or Year of Hell, where they're pretty self-contained. And this one, I think, is no different, even though it's spread over three episodes instead of two. It is so, even though it has implications on how Enterprise treats Vulcans going forward, and it references previous episodes with Vulcans, ultimately it is pretty self-contained, which I think separates it from, say, Countdown, 0 Hour, and the Council, which is not self-contained. It's part of the larger Xindi story arc, and same with your DS9, Sacrifice of Angels, Favor of the Bold, whatnot. They're a part of a larger arc anyway, which is why I didn't bother reviewing those as a two-parter. So, I know it's very extremely arbitrary, and many YouTubers have done it differently, and I don't, they're welcome to do it differently, but ultimately I had to decide how I wanted to do it. This is how I wanted to do it. So anyway, all that out of the way, The Forge, Awakenings, and Kir'shara are the episodes where Enterprise goes to Vulcan because the Earth embassy there was bombed, and they investigate who was responsible, and the leader of Vulcan, a man named Vosk, insists that it was the Syrian Knights, which is a splinter Vulcan group. So T'Pol and Archer go to investigate the Syrian Knights and find out that they in fact are not responsible, in fact a peaceful group, and Vosk himself has a ruse to get rid of the Syrian Knights because he wants to start a war with the Andorians under the false pretenses that they have weapons of mass destruction when they absolutely do not. So Tucker and the Enterprise work with Saval to warn Shran and the Andorians, and they get together to try to stop the war from happening, while Archer acquires the Katra of Serac, the famed Vulcan from 1800 years ago who brought out the Age of Logic, and together they find this artifact, the Kir'shara, which unites all Vulcan and takes down Vosk's reign. So he gets arrested and removed from power, and so the war is prevented, and Vulcan is made anew. So that is basically the very quick summary of this three-parter. So let me talk about Manny Koto, because I think his fingerprints are really, really, really on this three-parter. And to me, this is one of my favorite episodes of Enterprise, or three-parter, whatever. One of my favorite segments of Enterprise. I think I did have it as like number 4 on my top 10, or number 3. No, it was number 3, I believe. And it really, to me, this represents my favorite of season 4 as well. It represents what made season 4 so great. Now, I'm sure if you've seen any of my videos, you know my opinion on Enterprise, that I hated the first 2 seasons, especially the second one, when it was mainly Brenna Brega and Rick Berman in charge. In season 3, I loved as my favorite, and season 4 is my second favorite. I also really loved. Now, season 3, Rick Berman and Brenna Brega were still in charge, but they were slowly being pushed out, and Manny Koto, that's when he joined the show, and he started taking over more towards the end of season 3, which is the part of season 3 I like the most. And then in season 4, he full on became the showrunner, and Brendan Brega himself describes his role in season 4 as just basically the money man with no really creative input. And it was basically all Manny Koto. Now, Manny Koto, I think, proved himself from season 4 to be a fanboy. And in fact, Brendan Brega himself said that season 4 of Enterprise is what that feel of the show is what the show should have been like from the beginning. He believes that Manny Koto should have been the showrunner from the beginning. And I completely 100% agree. I think this is, when I envisioned a prequel to the original series, this is the show I wanted, not that crap we got in the first 2 seasons. And in fact, getting back to this episode specifically, this episode was undoing a lot of the damage that the first 2 seasons done, particularly with the Vulcans. Now, I had complained a lot about the Vulcans and their portrayal in the first 2 seasons, as they were irrational, arrogant dickheads, and they were portrayed as the villains. I mean, there was this, I think it was Shockwave Part 2, where Saval was being, he was being irrational, and irrationally trying to stop Enterprise's mission when he had been proven wrong, and he had no reason to do so. It frustrated me, and I think it was terrible writing. I mean, not only is it inconsistent with the original series and all other Star Trek, and inconsistent with how the Vulcans were portrayed, that this is not how they were supposed to act, and it's also jarring to have the Vulcans, who we've seen as good guys and as heroes who we appreciate, be portrayed as basically a bunch of assholes. who are irrational and trying to keep our heroes down, and it's not what I want from Star Trek, and I don't think it makes any sense. And so I think Manny Koto appreciated that, and also didn't really, appreciate the Vulcans being used in such a manner. So he was coming up with an in-universe reason as to what changed in the Vulcans, why the Vulcans were such dickheads in the past, as opposed to, and showing in this episode basically brought about the change to them becoming more like the Vulcans that we're more familiar with from the original series and onwards. Now, you might consider that a retcon, but I don't know if I would. I would consider it more of a course correction. A retcon I think of more as there's something established in lore, and they just, we don't feel like doing that. Let's just ignore that and completely underdo it and make it meaningless because I want the plot to go in a different story. But sheer genetic enhancement. Excuse me. And it doesn't fit, and that's, in my opinion, very bad writing. Where here, that's not what they're doing. In my opinion, this is very good writing because they notice a mistake, and yet they come up with an in-universe reason on how that mistake is corrected, and it course corrects what should have been done in the first place. And so I like that. Now, I think of Enterprise later in this season did that with the Klingons, and why they don't have the bumps on the forehead in the original series, and they tried to come up with an excuse. And Discovery would come up with reasons why they have this technology, which is much more advanced in the original series, even when they're supposed to be taking 10 years before. They'd be where Pike was rip the hollow things out of the, and those kind of things I think is different than what's done here, because those are trying to explain away production issues and trying to come up with in-universe excuses to portray what was really just the difference between the show being made in the 60s and the show being made in 2017. And I fucking hate those. Even the one in Enterprise, I definitely include. I think that's a bullshit excuse, and the excuse doesn't even make sense about how they mixed the genetically enhanced augments blood with Klingons, and that's why they have flat foreheads. That's bullshit. Does that explain why Koloth and Kang had flat heads, and then 30 years later they look like normal Klingons? No, it does not. It is a bunch of bullshit. That really annoys the hell out of me. Of course, I'll get to that eventually when I cover that episode. But I'm just highlighting it to highlight the difference between what they did here in this Vulcan episode, because it's not bullshit, because they're not trying to course correct what is just simply a production issue or simply the time period the show was made. This is actually an in-story mistake issue that they're addressing, so it's perfectly okay for them to do that. Whereas them trying to explain away why Klingons in the 60s, the original series didn't have, the foreheads, or explain away why Discovery technology looks so much more advanced in the original series. I mean, the original series was made in the 60s, and it was a makeup change that they did later on because the technology advanced, and the same thing with Discovery. They're going to make a show in 2017. It's going to look more advanced than the 60s, and they're going to course correct to make the technology actually look futuristic, which, if they went back to this original series technology, wasn't really. We kind of surpassed some of that. So it's just a production thing, and that's something which I think there's no in-universe. Trying to come up with an in-universe reason for it is a fool's errand, in my opinion. It's simply suspension of disbelief. It's just because intellectually these shows are made 50 years apart, and it's just production issues. It's just advancement or change in direction. And having an in-universe excuse for it, how they try to explain away why the Klingons had no hair in season 1 by saying, they just shaved all their heads. Oh my god, that was so much bullshit. But anyway, So to me, that would be like if you have an actor, a different actor playing the same character, like Game of Thrones did it with Dario, and I'm sure there's other examples where you have a different actor play, or Savick, they had a different actor play Savick in the Star Trek movies. It's like them trying to come up with an in-universe reason why, Savick had a transporter accident that disfigured her and made her look totally different. No, don't do that. It's bullshit. You just intellectually know that it has to do with production, and you suspend disbelief. And so I personally don't consider that shit with the Klingons canon. I'm sorry, I don't care if it's in Enterprise. I think that's nonsense. But I'm not here to talk about that. I'm here to talk about these Vulcan episodes. Because as I said, their explanation as to how the Vulcans changed actually makes sense, because they're not trying to correct what is clearly a production issue. They're correcting a mishandling of writing. And they can correct that with writing. So I'm all okay with that. Anywho, so yeah, and I actually love the way that these episodes handled Saval, because the way his character changed to be more like friends with humanity, I felt natural. It felt like, it didn't feel like a retcon. It felt like character growth. So I think they earned it, and to be fair, they did slowly build up to this in previous seasons. I think in season 3 he only appeared in like the alternate reality and Twilight, because season 3 took place in the Zindi arc, so he wasn't really involved in that. But season 2, even though he was kind of a dickhead at the end of season 2, telling Paul not to leave or whatever, and just wanting Archer to let the Zindis destroy Earth, he still had that slow progression, like he was becoming a bit more friendly with Archer. And so to have his portrayal here, I felt like a natural progression, especially the way that Admiral Forrest sacrificed himself to save Saval's life. That felt like that would be a huge event that would push him more towards. And I liked his conversation with Tucker, the way, he was like, I don't like to admit this, but living on Earth, I acquired an affinity for humans and learned to appreciate them. And Tucker was like, oh, you hid that very well. And he's like, thank you. And of course, Tucker didn't intend that as a compliment. He was trying to say, well, you were being a dickhead, so I would have never guessed you actually liked us. And he was like, oh, thank you. And it's very reminiscent of Spock and the way he would react in the original series, how whenever anyone told him he wasn't being human or said he's inhuman, he would always take it as a compliment. So I liked it. And that's the thing about Manikoto. And I think it's present throughout all of season 4. I think it's most present in this 3-parter, is that they do reference, it feels more like it fits with the original series. They not only do they reference it, but the characters behave more like what's in line with Star Trek lore, which is something that I think Brennan Braga and Rick Berman gave no shits about during the first 2 seasons. They just wanted to make their own astronaut show, and they just wanted to steal the Star Trek names so they could have an established fan base, when they had no intention of actually honoring Star Trek or the lore or the field. But that's just my opinion. Manny Coda was obviously a huge fan who did really, and I think Brendan Braga himself recognized this, and that's why he said Manny Coda should have been the showrunner from the beginning. But anyway, speaking of recognizing Star Trek lore, there's a lot of references in this episode. There's a lot of callbacks to the animated series episode Yesteryear, with the Forge, which was featured in Yesteryear, so when Spock ran off with his pet Sailot, and of course they make a reference to Sailot, which of course was first mentioned in Journey to Bible. I still can't get over the fact that Amanda referred to it as a teddy bear. I mean, it's a freaking tiger, tiger and a bear crossed together. That is not a teddy bear. Teddy bear is not alive. Like if she had said like puppy dog, I mean, that's still a very, very loose comparison, but at least they're both pets and not a stuffed toy, because Spock had to specify, or our teddy bears are alive and have 6-inch fangs. I'm like, that's not really a fucking teddy bear, is it? It's nowhere near a teddy bear, so that's a stupid comparison I don't get. But anyway, that's a rant against the original series. But that was established in the lore, so they had to stick with it. But they kind of just 86 the whole teddy bear reference, which was a smart idea because it was dumb to begin with. But anyway, they showed this a lot in the animated series episode, and of course you saw a couple here, which was cool. And of course T'Pol mentioned that Vulcans keep them as pets, and it was in a more sort of believable way, where she said that the domesticated version is different, smaller and less hostile. And Archer is like, well, I bet you, said something like, I bet you the Vulcan children are very careful not to be late with their dinner. And T'Pol's like, the Vulcan children are never late with the Selot's dinner. So that was a good exchange. I liked that. It made sense. And it's sort of, again, kind of correcting some of the issues with established canon. Now, then there's also T'Pol, whose name is too similar to T'Pol. T'Pol. Anyway, she was in the original series. She was in Amok Time. But yeah, she was definitely the one who was in Amok Time who, proceeded over the sort of wedding of Spock, whatever, in the fight between Spock and Kirk. And in that episode, it was said that she was a very renowned figure of the Federation. Yet she was very stemmed and Vulcan-ish, a bit standoffish to humans. I think seeing this as her origin story, it makes a fuck ton of sense. I think it totally fit with it, and I think bravo for taking such a minor character and sort of showing her origin, so to speak. Because they can do that because Vulcans live long, and plus she was really old in the original series time, so that all lines up. I like this episode's use of Katra, because Katra is obviously just a bullshit thing that they made up as an excuse to bring Spock back to life in Star Trek 3. Let's be honest. Let's be fair here. Let's be honest with ourselves. And it kind of didn't make sense. And in that movie, they said, it hasn't been done for 10,000 years. And, of course, here we see it done 100 years ago. So that's a stupid line anyway. And I think they said the same thing about mind meld in the original series. This practice hasn't been done for thousands of years. Yeah, we see it done here. So those stupid lines that you can't honor because they make no sense, so you shouldn't try to honor them. I mean, there's a lot of shit like that in the original series. You just gotta ignore it. And you're breaking canon. Yeah, but they can't keep in the canon because it would make no sense. Anyway. So that was really cool. I like the whole concept of Sirac's Katra. And Sirac, again, is another. He's a more sort of used reference, who's referenced actually a lot throughout Star Trek lore. I was first brought up, and oh my god, I'm pretty sure it was the Savage Curtain of the original series. Help me, Spock! Help me! God, that's one of the worst episodes of the entire Star Trek franchise. But he was. I think that's when he was created, and he was seen as kind of like the Jesus figure. Kind of the way Kahless, of course, he was also in that episode. Don't get me started. Help me, Spock. I'm sorry, that episode's so terrible. But how Kahless is kind of the Jesus figure to the Klingons. Sirac was kind of the Jesus figure to the Vulcans, yet he was sort of more of the father of logic. The Vulcans were warring amongst themselves or whatever, and he is the one who kind of put an end to it by bringing logic to everyone. And to see him interact with Archer and have his Katra inside Archer's head, that was cool. I think that was good use of lore. I think it really, really worked. And I think like the structure of these episodes, particularly starting with the first one, The Forge, where it's mainly about Archer and T'Pol, going through the desert trying to find the Syrian Knights, and they, got all the reference like the Salot, and they got the dude they meet who puts the Katra in Archer's head. Like, that was all good stuff, and they reference like Enterprise lore, such as T'Pol's mother and how she turns out to be a Syrian Knight. Like, that was all really good stuff, and then they meet T'Pol, and she's kind of a dick to humans and standoffish, but it shows her own progression within this episode, so it makes sense that she would become the woman that she becomes later by the end of it. And so you get the next episode, Awakenings, which deals mostly with the Katra and how Serac purposely wants it to be in a human because he needs an outsider who's not too sort of mind has been warped by modern Vulcan culture, who can look at it from a more objective standpoint, which is very logical, let's say, and that makes a lot of sense. And I like how T'Pol was actually letting her prejudice overcome her, and I think T'Pol's mother even pointed this out. She's like, well, we can't let the Katra stay in this human. The human can't have the Katra. And it's like, well, you're letting your prejudice get the better of you. And then she comes to realize that Serac wanted to stay in the human because he was an outsider. And as I said, perfectly logical, makes a lot of sense. Now, then we get into the next episode, Kir'shara. And I guess this might be my least favorite of the three. I'm not sure. Maybe. Because it has that long torture scene with Shran torturing Saval, which I thought, I kind of like it, I kind of didn't. It was an interesting character development where Shran learns to appreciate Saval, and I do like Saval sort of laughing at him and saying his name will mean fool in Andorian. Like, that was a pretty good jab, but I think those torture scenes went on for a bit too long, and I was a bit bored with them. But, they were okay. But anyway, the concept of the Kir'shara, it does seem like a very stereotypical, like, fantasy-esque trope where there's this artifact that is going to bring about peace. It's like a magical artifact. Now, to be fair, this artifact doesn't actually possess any magical powers, which is something you would see in a lot. I think Next Generation even did this a lot with the Taksu Tot, which could cause supernovas, or this other artifact, which was a recording that a lot of people think was a huge weapon, but just a recording with a female changeling. And, and usually, because in real life artifacts are just artifacts that tell us about the past. They don't possess any magical powers. And they kind of skirted the line on this one because it did not possess any magical powers. It didn't shoot light into Vosk and turn him good or anything like that. But it did project this hologram thingies, and everyone's like, "Oh, look at that! It's actually Kir'shara." So, so it did kind of do something, but it wasn't magical. It didn't magically transform or do anything. It just proved that it was the Kir'shara, and it proved to the Vulcans that that a lot of what the Syrian Knights are saying about Serac and how they strayed from his teachings is actually true. Now, again, it is kind of fantastical, though, the way that all the Vulcans were instantly this completely changes us. We're fools. Let's get rid of this prime minister, whatever the hell leader they were calling him, supreme leader, whatever they called him. Let's just kick him out and get this new guy and completely change our ways just because this artifact exists. I don't think that's how that stuff really works. I think it actually takes years to affect change on that level. It's not instant like that, but it's for storytelling purposes. We don't have years to wait. Come on, we gotta be snippy with this. We gotta do it in this 3-parter. So that's fine. I'm willing to suspend my disbelief on that one because it is great storytelling. I gotta admit, it was such an awesome moment when Archer took the Kir'shara into that thing, and it's all the hollow. Oh, look, it's the Kir'shara! That was cool. I actually really liked that, and I liked how that's what stopped the fighting with the Andorians. So I think it was very effective, even though it was kind of a typical fantasy trope where Archer's like, we gotta find this magical artifact, and they go and find it, and they take it, and it changes everything, the One Ring or whatever. But ultimately, I'm willing to go with it. So can I talk about how this whole, like, especially the last part, but basically this whole trilogy is a giant analogy for the Iraq War? I think it's funny because I mentioned this on my channel before, but I haven't heard anyone else. I don't believe I've ever heard anyone else mention this. A lot of people talk about how the Zindi story arc was a huge analogy for 9/11 and like the war in Afghanistan, which it totally was. Funny thing is, I didn't actually notice that until like years later, even though looking back on it, it was like beyond obvious, especially the first episode when Earth got attacked. I mean, the 9/11 analogy was just smacking you in the face, and for some reason I was just oblivious to it. I mean, as soon as someone pointed it out to me, I was like, oh yeah, of course. But I just didn't think of it. But with this episode, when I first watched it, I was like, Iraq War. And yet, I haven't heard anyone else make that analogy. To me, I mean, come on. To me, is beyond obvious. Okay, so you have a corrupt leader who wants to attack or start a war for his own like personal gain, his own financial gain, shall we say, and he uses the excuse that the other side that he wants to start a war with has weapons of mass destruction that they don't actually have. I mean, come on! It's so obvious. I mean, I don't know how anyone couldn't see this. And not only is it like an analogy for the Iraq War, it is very anti-Iraq War. And mind you, this episode came out in 2005, where I think support for the Iraq War started to wane in 2005. Like in 2003, like you were ostracized. Like I remember literally watching talk shows, daytime talk shows where someone was against the war and they were like mocked and made fun of in 2003. Like in all the I told you about, like fiction I read where they said there's going to be Disneyland in Iraq and all this shit. You were literally ostracized if you were against the Iraq War in 2003. Now in 2005, they did start to support for the war did start to wane a bit. It wasn't as sort of rigid, but even though, like, I gotta admit, even 2003, the protests, which I actually went to, by the way, so I do kind of feel like I have a dog in this race, because I was very, very anti-war, Iraq War from the very beginning. But the protests were the largest. These protests for the Iraq War were larger than protests for the Vietnam War. Worldwide, not U.S., but worldwide. The anti-war group was actually larger than the Vietnam anti-war group, yet it got zero attention. In fact, as I said, in public sight and media, you were ostracized, diminished, mocked if you were against the war. But by the time we got to 2005, it started to wane a bit, but it was still the majority, especially the media and what was acceptable, was still very, very supportive of the war and did sort of mock you if you were against it. So it wasn't until like 2006 or 2007, 2008 when the whole popular opinion started to be against the war. Once they finally start to realize, a bit too late, that the war was a huge mistake and never should have happened, which is what people like me have been saying from the very fucking beginning. But whatever. But anyway, anyway. So it was brave for this episode to do such a blatant anti-Iraq war message, but they did it under the guise of science fiction. Apparently, it feels like sometimes I'm the only one who noticed. It seems like no one really knows, but and it's just so obvious to me. Now, even like they even had their own version of a 9/11 analogy in this. Now, because they did a different one for the Xindi arc, that was when the Xindi attacked Earth and killed 7 million people, and that was seen as like. But that was used more for, as I said, Afghanistan war analogy, where that war wasn't necessarily unjustified, but of course the way Enterprise handled it was very different than the way the U.S. handled it. Anyway, because this is Star Trek, and they did it the Star Trek way. But, and yeah, and it was like the whole Xindi were sort of a metaphor for all the different factions in Afghanistan, how you can't just go in and try to kick ass, that you have to deal with the different politics there. Whereas this used the destruction of the Vulcan embassy, or the Earth embassy on Vulcan, as their version of 9/11, not nearly as like drastic as the one that they used for the Xindi. Here was 41 people who died, but still 41 people is 41 people. And so that set off that was just used as an excuse to start the war with the Andorians, much like the way the Bush administration used 9/11 as an excuse to start a war in Iraq, even though Iraq had absolutely nothing to do with 9/11, but the majority of the Americans, and particularly Bush supporters, believed that it did, when there was actually zero evidence. In fact, he tried to manufacture evidence when it was total bullshit. Just like in this episode, where Voss tries to manufacture evidence that at first you notice, like eventually he blames the Syrian Knights, but you notice the first thing he did was to blame the Andorians, because he wants to set up for a war with the Andorians. And then he blames the Syrian Knights, and he uses this as an excuse to wipe out the Syrian Knights. Now, the Syrian Knights, I'm less certain of the metaphor there, but I personally believe that they represent peaceful protesters who protested the Iraq War, such as myself. I mean, I only went to one protest. It wasn't like I was huge out there, so I shouldn't like claim I was as hugely. I just went to one protest, sat around, and be like, "Yay, whatever." but anyway, people who were very much against the Iraq War, and I think that's who the Syrian Knights represent, because they were actually peaceful, and as I said, in 2003 especially, they were demonized by the media, called radicals, called all sorts of terrible names, and also says, "Look at these idiots," and they of course turned out to be right. But and I think that's where the analogy comes in, because the way Voss demonizes the Syrian Knights is very similar to how protesters of the Iraq War were demonized, when really they were like, hey, we're actually pacifists, just like the Syrian Knights turned out to be pacifists. And of course they weren't responsible for the bombing of the embassy. Now, unfortunately, if you follow my analogy here, you could also go into a way that say that this is supporting 9/11 trutherism and 9/11 truthers, which I don't think is intentional on the show's part, because in this episode, Vosk actually was responsible for the act of terrorism himself and just blamed it on other people in order for him to start a war, and that's what 9/11 truthers infer, that Bush himself or the government perpetrated the attacks in 9/11 in order to start a war with Iraq, which I don't believe, and I really don't think that's what the show is trying to say. They just did their narrative a bit differently, but one could read it that way, but I personally don't think that's what they're getting at. But god damn, Vosk was such a sort of Bush-Cheney analogy, and I think it's obvious. I'm surprised that anyone couldn't see that, but anyway, I did like the reveal at the end of the episode that showed that Voss was actually working for the Romulans, which makes total sense, and this was sort of set up a larger story arc that was supposed to go into Season 5, but Season 5 never happened, unfortunately. That would begin the Romulan War, but they did show more of the Romulans in the next trilogy that had the Unity trilogy, where they were behind the scenes sort of trying to start wars between the forces, because that's what they're doing here. They want to start wars. They're very reminiscent of the Dominion in that way, is that they want to weaken all of their sides before they actually go to war with them. And of course, that's completely 1,000% in the Romulans' character to be, have espionage and try to start shit like that. And so it does make complete sense that Vosk was simply an agent for the Romulans, and of course he was doing this for his own personal gain. But anyway, I thought that was a really nice reveal. So, yeah, I'm wondering if there's any nooks and crannies about these 3 episodes I'm missing. I don't think so. I talked to, like, Tripping. Usually not a fan with Trip, but him being in command of the Enterprise for most of this trilogy, I thought worked. I did appreciate it. I liked the sort of interaction between the characters. Again, season 4 made these bland characters way more interesting. Of course, it did start in season 3, but it definitely got even better in season 4, where these characters were like really two-dimensional and just flat and boring as hell and uninteresting in the first 2 seasons. Watching it, so it's very interesting to go from watching a season 2 episode straight to watching this. You can really see the stark difference. Like, there was a scene where Mayweather and Reed, who are usually like boring characters I don't give a fuck about, were and examining the wreckage of the terrorist attack on the embassy, and they find a bomb that's still intact. And like Mayweather was like holding up this thing where the bomb was right there, so he had to hold it up so the bomb wouldn't go off. Where Reed was trying to scan it, and he scanned it, and it started to go off. And like, fuck, beam us out of here! Like, that was a really intense scene. That was a great scene, and it's really, I just can't understate how much better this season is than the earlier seasons. I went on and on about this in my season 3 review of Enterprise, but I don't think I've really touched on it as much. That it absolutely applies to season 4 as well. That's why I love Enterprise. I mean, I fucking hate the first 2 seasons. I still maintain they're the worst seasons of the entire Star Trek franchise. Yes, worse than Discovery or Picard or anything recent. Definitely. I reassert that. Definitely. But season 3 and 4 were actually really good, and it's actually really commendable that they took this flat show and these flat characters and made them interesting. It's really commendable. So that's probably why I give it even more praise. So yeah, and I think that high quality was featured throughout these 3-parters. So it is, I think, one of the best episodes of the entire Star Trek franchise. Maybe not top 10, but definitely top 10 for Enterprise. As I said, I think it was number 3 for me. So this is an achievement. And I think in so many ways, I love the fact that it is criticizing the Iraq War. I love the fact that it changes the Vulcans. And course corrects the bullshit they did in the first 2 seasons. And I love the way the story played out. And I love the character development and how that led to resolving that husband guy who forced T'Pol to marry him, and how he let her go at the end. That was a nice resolution to that too. And Shran and Saval and all these characters that like they really push forward, even like people like Tucker and Reed. So I think, yeah, amazing, absolutely amazing episode. So my rating for The Forge, Awakening, and Kir'shara out of 10, of course, is a 10, the best. Absolutely amazing 3-parter, one of the highlights of the Star Trek franchise, and certainly one of the highlights of Enterprise, and really changes it from being a kind of mediocre show to just an amazing show, despite its horrible first 2 seasons. Anyway, that is it for my review for The Forge, Awakening, and Kir'shara. Be sure to check out my channel for more Star Trek episode reviews and many more reviews on many other shows, such as The Expanse, many other Star Trek shows, Breaking Bad, The Outer Limits, and more. So be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all that. And thanks a lot for watching.